Thank you for coming this evening. First, let me begin with the end in mind. Following the program, Congregation Ocean Reef will move to the front lawn for a brief blessing to light the Hanukkah candles. Everyone is welcome. Second, I know there are several other events pending tonight. I promise we will end promptly. Lastly, once our speaker has completed his prepared remarks, we will have a question and answer session led by Reverend Henley and me. We welcome your questions. Please let Rachel and Carolyn know if you would like a note card and pen to draft a question. If you raise your hand now or at the end of the remarks, they will give you what you need, and then they will then bring your questions up to Bob and me to be considered. We hope to get to as many questions as possible. We selected tonight for these remarks specifically because it occurs during Hanukkah. Hanukkah is not the Jewish Christmas, nor is it even a holiday. Hanukkah is a festival, the festival of light over darkness, the triumph of freedom. This festival is celebrated because 3 miracles occurred over 2,000 years ago in the 2nd century BCE with the restoration of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. A small, outmanned army of Jews made a revolt against the Seleucid king Antiochus, who banned traditional Jewish practice, sought to expel Judaism from the land of Israel, murdering women who circumcised their sons, and burned every copy of the Torah they could. A small army, led by Judah Maccabee, won a miraculous victory over the Seleucids to allow for the rededication of the Second Temple. The victory was the first miracle. In every Jewish temple, an eternal light burns 24 hours a day to symbolize God's eternal presence, and therefore is never extinguished. It requires purified kosher oil. Antiochus destroyed all the pure oil, but in a back storeroom, a small vial, enough oil for 1 day was found, the second miracle. Even though it takes 8 days to make oil kosher, the flame was lit, and the third miracle occurred. The flame burned for all 8 days. Hanukkah celebrates bringing light into the world out of the shadows of darkness. And Hanukkah reminds us special circumstances, even miracles, are necessary to defeat adversaries. Tonight, Ken Wollack will speak to the challenges we face in the world today, the forces of authoritarianism and darkness that seek to undermine basic principles of decency, democracy, and pluralism. Ken will also connect the dots as he discusses the global conflicts that exist due to the rise of coordinated authoritarianism, Israel-Hamas, Ukraine-Russia, Taiwan-China, and everything decent versus dark and evil, Iran and North Korea. Ken has devoted the majority of his career to defending, promoting, and expanding democracy throughout the globe. As the chief executive of the National Democratic Institute, and now the chair of the National Endowment for Democracy, both small d institutions, Ken has traveled to over 100 countries, many multiple times, in some of the most difficult circumstances in war: Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, Chile, and others, all with the mission to expand democratic institutions. Hopefully, we won't need yet another miracle for the points of light to break through and shine bright. Please join me in welcoming Ken Wollack.
The endowment, which I now chair, brings together Democrats, Republicans, labor, and business to work together to support democratic values, institutions, and processes globally, funded by the United States Congress. Now, I would point out candidly that these efforts were, in certain circles and at certain times, an issue of some debate. Paradoxically, it was seen as too bellicose, conflated wrongly with regime change, or worse, military force, as were the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, or too soft or idealistic as a response to serious security threats. The real issue, however, is not whether democracy promotion is hard or soft, or fits into the realism or idealism foreign policy paradigm. The issue is whether advancing democracy is not only the right thing to do, which is why I became involved some 37 years ago, but it's also a means of advancing our interests and protecting our security. And I think the answer is clearly yes. We are now witnessing what some would describe as a Hobbesian world, where war, or the potential for war, along three primary fronts are threatening to disrupt the world order and pose a direct challenge to American interests and those of our friends and allies around the world. There is the unprovoked and ongoing Russian war against Ukraine, terrorist attacks against Israel by Iranian-backed groups in Gaza, Lebanon, and Yemen, groups that operate like state armies with significant manpower, sophisticated weaponry, and advanced training, and Chinese threats against Taiwan as a possible prelude to the imposition of one China through military force. Now, this fire hose of bad news has one common thread. They all represent aggression by non-democratic and malign forces against neighboring democracies. We have learned a few things about the relationship between democracy and security over the past 40 years. First, that regimes that brutalize their own citizens are more likely to act aggressively against their neighbors. In fact, it is hard to find an example in modern history in which one democratic state has waged war against another democracy. And I leave it to you all to try to come up with an exception or two while I continue my remarks. Second, that hotspots more likely to erupt into violence are found, for the most part, in areas of the world that are non-democratic, places where our Pentagon has defined as the arc of instability. These are places that harbor terrorists, experience ethnic conflict and civil war, and they generate refugee flows across borders. Today, the global number of refugees exceeds 70 million people, the most in history. It was former Secretary of Defense James Mattis who once quipped that people do not flee from a free press. Third, in this interconnected and interdependent world, what happens for good or for evil within borders of nations has regional and sometimes global impact. Now, contrary to that famous tagline in tourism marketing, what happens, let's say, in Caracas, Kiev, or Khartoum, in Moscow or Managua, or in Beijing or Beirut, doesn't stay there. Our highly respected CIA Director, Bill Burns, has described this phenomenon as problems without passports. Now, Franklin Roosevelt foresaw these changes 80 years ago. In preparing his 1941 State of the Union address, best known as the Four Freedoms speech, Roosevelt confidant Harry Hopkins protested against using the phrase everywhere in the world. That covers an awful lot of territory, Mr. President, Hopkins said. I don't know how interested Americans are going to be in the people of Java. To which the President replied, I'm afraid they will have to be someday, Harry. The world is getting so small that even the people of Java are getting to be our neighbors. Now, in connecting the dots between conflict, authoritarianism, and the future of democracy, as these remarks have been titled, I would begin with the bad news. Ann Applebaum, the scholar and journalist who sits with me on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, has labeled the growing ties between autocratic regimes as Autocracy, Inc., an enterprise led by China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Others have referred to this coalition by its acronyms, the CRINCs: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Client states or junior partners in Autocracy, Inc. include Burma, Nicaragua, Cambodia, Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, Belarus, and the states of the Western Sahel that have recently experienced military coups. They also include a network of terrorist groups that run from Yemen, Iraq, and Gaza to Syria and Lebanon. Now, these countries and groups have benefited from Inc.'s senior partners, who provide an array of economic and security assistance and political and diplomatic support. Autocracy Inc., or the Crinks, are not linked by ideology. They are communists, ultra-nationalists, and theocrats. They have built corrupt financial structures, developed strong security cooperation, and established far-flung media operations. Because their goal is to enrich themselves and to maintain their grip on power, they are more or less impervious to international criticism. What we have seen as a common feature of their use domestically of almost unimaginable brute force to put down any real or perceived threat to their grip on power. They are driven by fear that any separate centers of power from the state or even alternative ideas within society lead inevitably to a color revolution. A reference to democratic uprisings in Ukraine, Georgia, Serbia, and Kyrgyzstan, or the 1986 People Power Revolution in the Philippines, or the 2010 Arab Spring. What is new is Autocracy Inc.'s expanding efforts to reach across borders, to prevent democracy where it does not exist, and to undermine democratic institutions and discourse where it does. To Putin, a democratic and prosperous Ukraine would be a powerful engine for change inside Russia. For Communist Party Chairman Xi Jinping, the same can be said of Hong Kong and Taiwan. Now, Autocracy Inc.'s growing cooperation and global campaign were front and center when Chairman Xi visited Russia last March. And I quote, "Now there are changes that haven't happened in 100 years," Xi declared upon departing Moscow.
Is this needed, do you think? Okay. Does that work? Is that better? Okay.
And I'll repeat his quote. "Now there are changes that haven't happened in 100 years," Xi declared upon departing Moscow. "When we are together, we drive these changes." Now, to be honest, the Crinks are not the source of all anti-democratic behavior globally. There are homegrown autocrats whose existence preceded the global ambitions of Moscow or Beijing. And it is true that authoritarian regimes were also built on the ashes of democratic governments that failed to deliver on the promise of democracy or to maintain security for their citizens. Hugo Chavez, the late dictator of Venezuela, once proclaimed that he was not the cause, he was the result. What he meant was that the political institutions of Venezuela, once South America's most stable democracy, lost the confidence of the citizenry, paving the way for his rise. What is new is that these local autocrats can now count on a powerful international support network far beyond their borders. And Democrats in these places are finding that they confront not only their own authoritarian regimes, but multiple autocrats in multiple countries. This so-called transnational repression takes on many forms. The most extreme is the deployment of Russian paramilitary forces through the Wagner Group in places like Mali, the Central African Republic, and Sudan to protect military regimes that came to power through coups. The same may come to pass in Niger and Burkina Faso, where military-led governments may shortly ask the Wagner Group into their countries. And now there is a new and growing form of transnational repression that is less lethal but no less effective, called sharp power. Russia and China are going well beyond trying to win the hearts and minds of leaders abroad, but seek to undermine the idea of and subvert democracy itself. These efforts range from Kremlin propaganda, fake news sites, and troll farms that spread disinformation, stoke polarization, and skew electoral outcomes, to Chinese Communist Party initiatives that use cash to influence journalists and scholars, and establishing schools that teach ruling party operatives in African states methods for retaining power, even in multi-party systems. The Chinese approach is to preach the techniques of fusion, that is, the melding of the ruling party and the state. China's most expansive program is its Belt and Roads Initiative, whereby large infrastructure projects are built with a lack of transparency and often result in large debts incurred by recipient countries. This so-called debt trap diplomacy gives China growing leverage over the sovereignty of countries in the developing world. In addition, regional initiatives have been built to create alternative, if not a replacement, for the institutions of world order that were created after World War II. A precursor to Autocracy, Inc., the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, was established 22 years ago by China and Russia and promotes military, economic, and political cooperation among its members. Along with BRICS, led by Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa, these two intergovernmental groups have two things in common. They both are absent Western democracies and welcome authoritarian members. They promote the doctrine of state sovereignty as a means to repel human rights standards that traditional intergovernmental organizations include in their founding principles. Now, for the good news. And there is some. Autocracy, Inc. is failing a series of stress tests, as would have been predicted by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson in their highly acclaimed book, Why Nations Fail. The problem with authoritarian regimes, they wrote, is that when they are wrong, there is no one to stop them from disastrous results. China's march to economic prosperity masked the millions who were killed during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And in recent months, widespread protests over COVID restriction policies have morphed into opposition to Xi Jinping's arrogation of political power. And at the same time, China's economy has stalled. Only last week, Moody's cut China's credit outlook from stable to negative. If the stage was set for Beijing to present itself as a global model, it is failing. In the case of Russia, Putin grossly underestimated Ukrainian military prowess and resolve and overestimated the military capabilities and tactics of his own forces. His military has been degraded dramatically, and the once second most powerful military force in the world has been relegated to the second most powerful military force in Ukraine. And in Iran, we saw the emergence of the world's largest civil rights movement, a movement that may very well have been inspired by the courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people. So while Autocracy, Inc.'s strength derives in part from its cohesion, its inevitable failures become contagious. This is one of the many reasons why it is so important that Ukraine prevails in this war, that Hamas be defeated, and that Taiwan's deterrent strength against Chinese aggression be maintained and strengthened. Now, serious research shows that we have now entered the 17th year of a democratic recession globally, with a decline in political rights, civil liberties, and global freedom, and a rise of right-wing populism in traditional democracies, and continued repression in non-democratic places. Not an optimistic outlook, but one based on empirical evidence. This, after more than 20 years of a wave of democratic change in every region of the world following the transitions of Spain and Portugal in the 1970s. If we believe that peace, stability, and prosperity are inexorably linked to systems of government that are legitimate, accountable, and responsive, we don't have the luxury of complacency in responding to today's challenges. In conclusion, let me say that those of us in the democracy business tend to be optimists. But as Madeleine Albright, the late chairman of the organization I headed for 25 years, used to say, we are optimists who worry a lot. 4 months before her death in 2022, she wrote a major article in Foreign Affairs magazine in which she predicted the coming democratic revival. I would recommend it for your reading. We take comfort in knowing that people in every region of the world continue to seek freedom, to demand their rights. Yes, they seek jobs, shelter, food, and security, but no less a political voice. And we know that democratic progress is inseparable from democratic cooperation. That is the reason why our country must continue to recommit itself to using all the tools in our toolkit: security, diplomatic, political, economic, and high tech, to renew faith overseas in the power of collaboration among free governments, independent media, workers, faith-based groups, enlightened corporations, political parties, and civil society. This requires an ongoing call to action by governments and non-governmental groups alike in the pursuit of our collective values and interests. Thank you very much.
Okay, again, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, Rachel and Carol will be happy to pick them up and we'll bring them up here. Ken, I got one question right off the bat that perhaps you could answer, and we'll pass the microphone back and forth because this otherwise isn't working. National Endowment for Democracy, and other groups associated. National Endowment for Democracy and other groups, are they a think tank or are they action-oriented entities?
The National Endowment for Democracy, as I said, was
Can't hold that up yet.
was founded by a speech that President Reagan gave, and then a bipartisan initiative led by Congressman Dante Fascell in the Congress. And it was viewed that much of the work that has to be done to promote democracy overseas shouldn't be done by government. It has to be done by non-governmental groups, but supported by government. A view Senator Dick Lugar used to call a public-private partnership. It's not a think tank, although we all do a lot of thinking. It is a do tank, in a sense. The endowment has a very bipartisan board, from Elise Stefanik to Karen Bass. And it has 4 affiliated institutes. The National Democratic Institute, affiliated with large D Democrats. The International Republican Institute, affiliated with the Republican Party. The Solidarity Center, affiliated with the AFL-CIO, and the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is affiliated with the Chamber of Commerce. Because these are institutions of our democracy linking up with small d Democrats overseas, and sort of being an American chapter of international
organizations that contribute to democracy in their own countries. Those 4 institutes have offices all over the world, probably collectively over 150 offices. NDI, which I headed for 25 years, had 55 offices, a staff of 1,300, representing about 100 nationalities. So it wasn't an American enterprise going over saying, this is what we do in the United States, you should adopt it, but rather it's sharing experiences and expertise across borders and regions, that we were part of an international network. And that support network had profound impact in a number of places around the world. The endowment itself, aside from those operational institutes, it is a grant-making organization that gives grants to civil society organizations and independent media, thousands of grants to these organizations on the ground in these countries that are advocating for their own political rights and are pushing reform and accountability in their governments.
Ken, here's a 3-part question. First of all, what is a multipolar world? Who's pushing it? And does it add to the stability or the instability of our world?
Well, the multipolar world is simply the post-Cold War world that we're living in. This is no longer 2 superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, nor is it the post-Cold War view of the United States being the remaining superpower. Now you have what's called emerging powers in the world that range from Brazil to India to China. Although China likes to call itself a developing country, it is far from simply a developing country. But you have these emerging powers. India is included in this as well. And so these are now countries that are on the world stage and have a great deal of influence. And as I said in my remarks, they are organizing separate from those traditional institutions that the United States set up in the post-war period. Some of these countries are good friends of the United States. They vote with us. They support us. They're allies, they're friends, but there are also countries that are not. This is not the G7. These are countries that want to create a separate power base in the world. And in many cases, because the common denominator is the presence of China and Russia in these bodies, they can pose a direct threat to our interests, and I think a direct threat to the development of stable democratic countries around the world, because they decry intervention in each other's affairs. Putin loves to talk about state sovereignty. It's ironic, given what he's doing in Ukraine. But the notion of that state sovereignty is you shouldn't have anything to say about how we treat our own people. And so that has become a common feature of many of these international groups and organizations. And I think it poses a direct threat to democratic progress around the world, and in many cases a direct threat to our security interests as well.
Okay, Ken, let's move to the conflict of the moment that's happening in the Middle East. Israel democracy surrounded by a number of states, none of which have democratic values. All backed by Iran. But let's look at the day after. The conflict continues, but what happens in the day after? We know 4 basic things can't happen. 1, Hamas cannot control the Gaza Strip. 2, Israel cannot control the Gaza Strip. 3, the Palestinian Authority does not have the ability to control the Gaza Strip. And 4, the Arab states and neighbors are unwilling to control the Gaza Strip. All 4 of those things can't be true, and yet they are part of the eventual outcome. What say you?
There's a diplomatic term of art in this. It's called oi.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Make your first statement.
I said there's a diplomatic term of art for this, and it's called oi. I have, since 1996, I have participated in international observer missions for most every Palestinian election that took place. The first being 1996, in which Yasser Arafat was elected. Subsequent elections, the 2006 elections, which brought Hamas to power. And I think it's fair to say that what took place on October 7th, first of all, it is hard to overstate the trauma that it has caused the Israeli public. And I think people don't quite understand the trauma. Because unlike the 1973 war, in which Egypt sort of threatened the deterrent strength of Israel, unlike our deterrent strength vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, was if you attack us, we'll destroy you. Israel's deterrent strength up until 1973 was you attack us, you're not going to be able to hurt us. And the United States was committed to maintain Israel's military superiority to ensure its deterrent strength. That was damaged badly in the 1973 war. And as those of you who've seen the movie with Helen Mirren and Golda, you will know what impact that had on Israeli society. This was entirely different because what it did was it undermined the raison d'etre of the entire state. A very close friend of mine who's a very prominent journalist in Israel, commentator, said in a quote in an article he wrote for an Israeli newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, but was picked up in the American press, in the New York Times and elsewhere, was he said, we're not only mourning for those who we lost, and he had lost a son in a bus bombing in Jerusalem years ago, and his wife had worked in Gaza for many, many years as a psychotherapist. And he said, not only did we lose hundreds and hundreds of people and we're mourning for their loss, but we're also mourning for the loss of the state. And the entire social contract between the state and its citizens were broken. And that was, we are here to protect not only Israelis that are living in this country, but we are a haven for Jews all over the world. Now it's, from this standpoint, in the post-October 7th, it's safer to be a Jew in Moscow than it is in Israel. And now you have 200,000 Israelis that have been displaced. So how do you restore the trust in a country where you've lost the state? The first thing it has to be is destroying Hamas so they can never do what they did on October 7th, despite their promises to do it again and again and again. The day after is much more difficult. I have no answers for it. This is my personal view, I have to believe that a reconstituted Palestinian Authority has to develop. Some reconstituted. The leader of the Palestinian Authority is an old man. He's going to have to pass. But in all likelihood, Bibi Netanyahu will be passing too, not in the same way politically. And the Israelis are going to have to determine what their new government looks like. The Israelis are also desperate for integration in the region. It's why you have millions of Israelis visiting the Gulf state. And they see that as a counterweight to Iran because they're now surrounded by the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in the north, the Hamas in the south. And as I said, these are state armies now. These are not terrorists with Molotov cocktails and stones. So, but if they're now going to be integrated in the region, they're going to have to do a lot more on the Palestinian issue than they have in the past, because these Arab states that are normalizing relations with Israel have to listen to the Arab streets. And they're going to be demanding a lot more from the Israelis. So the Israelis are going to have to determine how to deal with these existential issues. A new government. the divisions between secular and religious forces in the country, the issue of democracy, the rule of law issues that have not been resolved in the country. These are all huge issues. The one thing, however, if the Palestinians are going to make peace with Israel, they're going to have to speak 3 languages. They're going to have to speak Arabic to their own people. They're going to have to speak English to Washington, and they're going to have to speak Hebrew to Israelis. I happened to be in Jerusalem when Sadat visited the country. I was staying at the King David Hotel, total coincidence, and I saw how a simple visit by an Arab leader changed the outlook of an entire population, and that's what democracy does. You can change opinions literally overnight because of that simple gesture. Don't forget, Golda Meir once said that if I had a choice between peace with Egypt and retaining Sharm el-Sheikh, I'll hold on to Sharm el-Sheikh. And that led to major concessions on the part, territorial concessions on the part of the Israelis. But you're going to need, the Israelis are going to have to come to grips on the notion of a separate Palestinian state. And the Palestinians are going to have to come to grip that it has to be a post-Hamas a governance. There's got to be an interim period. I know that the administration is working on this right now with the Israelis and with the other Arab states and with the international community of how do you set up a transitional operation until you can have a Palestinian entity that can hold elections, has legitimacy, and it's all going to be very difficult because they're not going to want to do this on the backs of Israeli tanks. And so how you formulate that is going to be a huge diplomatic effort on the part of our administration, on the part of the Arab states, on the part of the Israelis, and on a Palestinian authority that is corrupt and weak. And so this is going to be a monumental task. But there's no alternative.
So is there a connection between the agreement that was in process between Saudi and the Israelis with the events that took place on the 7th of October?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's no love lost between Saudi Arabia and Hamas. Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood offshoot. And if it's the one thing that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states fear more than anything is the Muslim Brotherhood. So quietly and behind the scenes, though I'm sure they're shedding crocodile tears about the prospects of a Gaza that is Hamas-free. At the same time, as I said, they're going to have to listen to the streets. And so I think this puts back the normalization process, number one, for months, if not years, but it also reconstituting the normalization process will come with greater demands on a two-state solution for the Israelis. And how Netanyahu or a post-Netanyahu government deals with that will depend on the Israeli voters. And I don't know, I don't think anybody knows how the Israelis are going to vote in what likely will be a new election. Some people say, you know, in Israel, they tell the truth to the pollsters and then lie when they vote. So nobody quite knows what the Israelis are going to do in terms of a post-October 7th government in Israel, let alone a post-Gaza government going into the future.
Staying in the region and going to your point about Iran, what are the consequences of Iran as a nuclear power, and should the U.S. accept Iran's nuclear ambitions? If not, what should it do?
It's above my pay grade.
Softball.
I retired 5 years ago.
Yeah.
I said I retired 5 years ago, so I I think
About Iran's nuclear ambition.
what happens when Iran gets the nuclear capacity. I think that more than anything will set off a ripple effect in the region that will be quite dangerous. It would draw the United States further in. We will be required to maintain security for the Gulf states. I think it will encourage the normalization process between Israel and the Arab states, because that will be a powerful coalition against Iranian ambitions. But I would not rule out military action. I don't know how successful that is. I have friends that know this issue well, and they claim that it's very difficult to take out these sites militarily. But the one hopeful sign is the Iranian people. This is not a popular government among the Iranian people. We have seen this in the streets. We have seen this in private polls that have been conducted. And I wouldn't rule out the notion of outside pressure and internal turmoil by the people of the country. And I think we in the United States have to do everything in our power to support those forces on the ground that want a more open democratic system and don't want to be told how to live their lives by the theocrats who run the country. So I think that there's a combination of things that will be done militarily, in the democracy sphere, and politically, that they're going to. It's very hard for me to see how we live with Iranian nuclear capacity. I don't think that's going to happen. How that's going to be resolved economically, militarily, I don't know, and internally.
Another two-part question. How deeply rooted is anti-Semitism in the United Nations? And secondly, is the UN a useful institution in combating the authoritarianism that you spoke of?
On the first part of how great is anti-Semitism in the United Nations, the United Nations is not a club that's particularly friendly to Israel, and the reason is that those autocratic states have a great deal of power in UN committees, particularly the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations. So it's not a particularly friendly environment for the Israelis, and it never has been. I do believe, however, the world is imperfect. 40 years ago, when the National Endowment for Democracy began, the only groups that were engaged in promoting more open political systems around the world were the German political party foundations. There are 7 political parties in Germany receiving huge amounts of money from the Bundestag. And they not only support the development of political parties inside Germany, because we, the Allied forces, insisted upon that after the war. Because of the weakness of the political parties during the Weimar Republic, we wanted to make sure, the Allied forces wanted to make sure the Germans were investing in their political system and their political parties. Half of the budgets of these foundations, which is it's close to $1 billion, is for internal development of parties in the country. And the other half is to support democracy in other countries. And they had a huge role in helping to steer Spain and Portugal into the democratic camp in the 1970s. And the endowment and the institutes of the endowment were, in fact, in a way, patterned after the work of the German Party Foundation called Stiftungen. But we were the only ones doing this work. And today, that is not the case. There is now an international architecture that exists, and the United Nations does contribute to that in different ways, not with the same edge that we would do, but the United Nations Development Program, which is billions of dollars, that operates in the developing world, does provide support for democratic governance in places. And there are other bodies on women's political empowerment and other things that the UN does that are good. And even with all of its weaknesses, some of its peacekeeping efforts have been important. My view is it's not an ideal international organization, but if it didn't exist, somebody would have to invent it. And one of the things that Madeleine Albright tried to do mightily when she was ambassador to the UN is trying to reform this body. And it's very difficult to reform a huge bureaucracy. And because of these emerging powers that exist, and because of the aggressiveness of Russia and China and its surrogates around the world, it makes that task even harder.
At the crossroads of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia sits Turkey, a country that was founded modernly as a democracy and a Western-facing state, and now is something different. Is Turkey a friend or a foe, and how does that work within the global community now?
It is a friend and a foe. Turkey is. Now, Turkey's a NATO ally. It has a powerful military force. You have a president who is an autocrat, which does not fit well into the NATO model, because one of the things that NATO was formed around democratic principles, and he is, in a sense, an anomaly within in the NATO family. He goes back and forth with the Russians, the role that he plays in Armenia and Azerbaijan, the role he plays in Egypt, the role he plays with Hamas. He was a very effective mayor of Istanbul, and he was well liked. He was well respected, but he took a more or less religious turn when he became head of the government. So it's a relationship, and of course, he's created deep problems in northern Syria because he believes any type of Kurdish power in northern Syria, and the Kurds happen to be our friends in northern Syria. He considers that a direct threat to Turkey because he believes that the Kurds seek his overthrow, the overthrow of the government. He views them all as terrorists. So it's a very delicate relationship, and he can be very helpful at times, and he can be very destructive at times. And you've seen what happened with his relationships with Israel. It's on again, off again relationships with Israel. They've had very deep relationships in the past. In recent years, it's been virtually non-existent. They've started to reestablish relationships, but now again, because of the Gaza war, the relationships are quite cold now.
All of us watch these news reports of the student protests that are going on all over the country. Two questions. Is Israel an occupying power? And is Israel guilty of ethnic cleansing, as is being alleged by many of the protesters?
Yes, Israel is an occupying power. There's no doubt about it. By any standard, it is an occupying power by international law. It is not committing ethnic cleansing. Because you have the populations in the occupied territories that have increased. Ethnic cleansing and genocide usually coincides with a decrease in populations because you're trying to eliminate a certain group of people. But it is an occupying power, and this is what's so difficult for the Israelis, because it's very difficult for Israel to be a democratic state if it is occupying millions of Palestinians that do not have the same rights as 1/5 of the country who are Arab Israelis. And that occupation in perpetuity undermines the democratic character of the country. So Israel has ultimately a choice. It has a choice that can be a Jewish country or it can be a democratic country, and it has to come to grips. And on the other side, the Palestinians are going to have to come to grips with Israel, and how those two forces can come together and end the occupation in a way that gives Palestinians certain rights but does not threaten the security of the state of Israel is seen by many people as sort of a bridge too far. This is one of the conflicts people think that just can't be solved. I happen personally believe it has to be solved for the future of Israel.
Were the Abraham Accords helpful in any way?
Yeah, I think and I don't want to get too political here because I have these arguments with people. Like Dan, I worked at AIPAC, and I'm a strong believer in Israel. I was just at a international security conference in Halifax, Canada. And Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, the former defense minister, was there. And it was a quite interesting interview with him. He did not want to criticize the government at all regarding the war. He said, I don't want to be put in the dock. I'm here on foreign territory. We're in the midst of a war. We have to win that war. We have to defeat Hamas. Politics end at the water's edge. It used to be in the United States, and he still believes it must be the case in Israel. But he did say that, in his view, that Netanyahu played not a very positive game, in a sense that the Netanyahu government was building up Hamas all these years. So it would not be a threat to Israel, but it was there in order for the Israelis to say, listen, if you don't have us, you have these guys over here. It's the same way Mubarak used to say, if you don't have me, you've got the Muslim Brotherhood. And in that process, he undermined a lot of the democratic forces and many of the secular forces in Egypt. He weakened them and he strengthened the Muslim Brotherhood. They were represented in the parliament. And it was his way of saying, this is a choice that you have. And in essence, though, there was a symbiotic relationship between Mubarak and the Muslim Brotherhood. And in a way, I think Netanyahu saw Hamas and the Israeli government as having some type of symbiotic relationship. Something Barak talked about, how dangerous that policy was. And I think a lot of this is going to come out in the investigation of the war. And what was the Israeli strategy, and was this a strategy that was a prelude to this type of conflict? Because they allowed a lot of guttery funding that went into Gaza. The Israelis were willing to accept a conflict with Hamas every few years, which would lead to some type of ceasefire. But this changed the entire equation. I don't think anyone thought that Hamas would have this type of capability to do what it did, to present virtually a mortal threat to the state.
Yeah.
As the National Endowment for Democracy was born, it was at the end of the Cold War, and we went through a 20-year period where democracy was on the march globally and improving rather dramatically. Now, as you talk about the rise of populism and authoritarianism in many of these states, are we heading into a new Cold War?
I will say, though, the endowment was established when there was the Cold War. And one of the reasons why Reagan gave that speech at Westminster was to rally the democratic forces around the world against Soviet communism. And it was an interesting debate, because at the time, I hate to diverge, but it is interesting. There were Democrats in Congress that loved the idea of a National Endowment for Democracy, and there were Democrats who hated the idea because they thought it was some Ronald Reagan initiative. Dante Fascell, the congressman, said, Jesus, this is something we all thought everybody could like, Democrats, Republicans, business, and labor. Little did we know, he said, that it would raise suspicions on the part of everybody. Boy, if Democrats and Republicans, business, and labor can agree to this, we must oppose this. But there were those on the left who saw the endowment in those early years as sort of a tool simply to fight the Soviet Union. And so Ted Kennedy loved the endowment and Barney Frank hated the endowment. And on the right, the conservatives said, well, we have a lot of non-democratic friends around the world that are with us on this fight against Soviet communism. And we shouldn't be challenging them because of this larger struggle we are engaged in. So Orrin Hatch from Utah loved the endowment, and Jesse Helms hated the endowment. And I remember the fights over that during that time, and debates would go on. It was a $30 million appropriation. Today, the endowment's budget is over $300 million. But then the fights lasted for 5 hours. And I remember at the time we didn't know which shoulder to look over. That debate was ended because of two events. The People Power Revolution in the Philippines in 1986, in which Corazon Aquino defeated Ferdinand Marcos, a friend of the United States. And in Chile, the plebiscite in 1988 that defeated Pinochet and denied him another 8-year term as the dictator of Chile. Pinochet was a friend of the United States. And there was a view that the alternative to Marcos and the alternative to Pinochet would be the communist insurgency. That didn't happen. And Henry Kissinger was a member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy for a time, and I remember walking into a meeting and he said, the alternative to Pinochet is going to be the communists. And I said, Mr. Secretary, that's not the case. There is a whole array of small d Democrats from left of center to right of center that will be taking over after Pinochet. So the conservatives said, the alternative to Pinochet was not the communists. It was Christian Democrats and social Democrats and conservatives. When people were given a choice, they chose a democratic alternative. And the same was the case in the Philippines with Corazon Aquino. So the conservatives say, there is an alternative, a democratic alternative to these dictators. So they began changing their view. And for the Democrats in Congress, they said, this was not just about sort of a Cold War tool we were using. We were really struggling and fighting for democracy in these countries against non-democratic forces. So that whole debate changed. I think today, Dan, we are entering a period, I don't think I'd call it a Cold War because there are things that we have to resolve with the Chinese. There are issues, as we did with the Soviet Union over nuclear arms. There are things that we're going to have to do. But I don't believe the relationship with China is going to be any better than our relationship with the Soviet Union, given the way China behaves internationally and the way it behaves domestically. Don't forget, they're in great violation of their agreement on Hong Kong. The British turned over Hong Kong to the Chinese because there was going to be one country, two systems. And by 2017, there were supposed to be universal elections based on these basic laws in Hong Kong, and they just threw this out. And I have no doubt that they have similar plans for the Taiwanese down the road. So I think, yes, I don't think this relationship is going to be akin to what it was in the Soviet Union. I don't think both sides want to reach the point where there can be a nuclear confrontation, but I think the relationship is going to be very tense for the foreseeable future.
Last question for you, Ken. Changing subjects just slightly. You were co-chair of the Presidential Debate Commission in 2020. If the
Not what I thought retirement would look like.
This is the next to the last question.
okay,
Okay.
the
Commission on Presidential
debates.
is the commission that puts on the presidential and vice presidential debates every 4 years. It began doing this in 1988. I was the co-chairman of the debate commission for the last Biden-Trump debates, which, as you know, was a difficult endeavor.
And so our question, Ken, if the polls are correct, you will have a repeat of that debate, but will anyone else be on stage, including brothers of members of the Ocean Reef Club, perhaps?
The commission, Trump doesn't like the commission because he wanted to pick his own moderators for the debates. I was a co-chairman with Frank Fahrenkopf, who is the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, and Frank and I are very, very good friends going back many, many years. Frank was one of the founders of the National Endowment for Democracy, matter of fact, because he was chairman of the Republican National Committee at the time. So I've known him for many, many years. And the Republican National Committee has vowed not to participate in the debates, but it's not their decision, it's the decision of the candidate. And I think Trump will agree to participate, and I think Biden will agree, if they are the two nominees, would agree to participate simply because it is a 90 million person audience. It's the second most watched television show after the Super Bowl, and the second most watched television show in the world after the World Cup. And if CNN put on a debate, or ABC put on a debate, you would have 7 to 10 million people watching. You would not have 90 million people, because the commission has the White House feed, and everyone can air the debate. There are 3 criteria for the debates. One is you have to be constitutionally qualify. You have to constitutionally be over 35 years of age. You have to be born in the United States. Second criterion is that you have to be on the ballots in enough states that you could mathematically achieve 270 electoral votes. So if you're only in a handful of states, you can't sit on the debate stage. And the third criterion, which is the hardest, is you have to achieve 15% popularity among the electorate, decided by 5 polls that are selected by the commission. And so there's only been 2 other people who have been able to be on the stage, John Anderson, as you may remember, and Ross Perot. And there have been lawsuits against the commission and the Federal Election Commission, arguing that a third candidate should sit on that stage. And it was the argument of the commission that our job was not to jumpstart the campaign for somebody that had very little chance to win in the 11th hour of a campaign. The person has to be a viable candidate, and it can't simply be a spoiler for one of the 2 major candidates. Now, if an independent candidate can achieve 15%, and it has to be done prior to each debate. John Anderson qualified for the first debate. He did not qualify for the second debate. And Jimmy Carter refused to debate with him on the stage for that first debate. But there could be if somebody, but I tend to believe, people are going to choose between one of the 2 major candidates. That's just my feeling. I'm not going to prejudge the American electorate, But 15% is a hard hurdle. And the lawsuit that was presented went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and 2 years ago, the Supreme Court denied the claims by the group that was bringing a suit against the Federal Election Commission, against the commission.
Ken, this is the final question. First of all, it begins with this. Thank you for coming. Would you join me in thanking Ken? You'll like the first part of this question. Other than voting and writing checks to support your work, okay, all of this tonight, you two guys move in a realm that the average person does not. What can we, as individuals who have heard your presentation tonight, what can we as individuals do that makes a difference?
Well, you know, as many of you know, that, you know, we're having our own problems in this country. And when we have problems, it impacts the rest of the world. You know, people talk about when we sneeze, the rest of the world gets pneumonia. And one of the reasons why the debates are watched all over the world by hundreds and hundreds of millions of people is, in a sense, they wish they had the vote, because what the United States does has such a great impact on their lives. And I think, you know, when Reagan talked about the city on the hill, he talked about this country and represents something, I think, very, very important for the rest of the world. And when the rest of the world sees our politics as polarized as they are, it has a negative impact. And so the first thing that I would say, I'm not telling you who to support or not to support, is to get involved get involved here. And also you have a community here. I think it's important for people who have different views of the United States and policies and different views of the world should sit in one room and talk in a civil way with each other. And I think that's really important. And the more that that can be done in settings like this, the better this country will be. We're going through, I think, a very, very difficult time, and there are structural problems, there are political problems, and I've never seen a situation in Washington as bad as it is. And there are many things that have contributed to this. But I would say getting involved in politics here, you can write a check, you can canvass, you can engage in dialogue and communications. And then internationally, there are a lot of organizations like the Endowment who are non-governmental organizations, tax deductible, that you can contribute to. There are a number of organizations that do this work, and they're doing great work in some of the most difficult places in the world. And I will say one thing: the U.S. model is the sort of the bloom is off the rose a little bit, but for the people that are struggling for democracy overseas, many of them will say, "We wish we had the problems that you have." We're struggling every single day under the boot of a dictator, that we can't speak our mind. We can't run for office. We can't criticize the government. We can't operate a civic organization because the government thinks that that we're a threat to them. We can't run a small newspaper. We can't tweet. If you tweet in Egypt, you're going to be put in jail for seven years if you tweet anything that raises questions about the way President Sisi runs the country. So these people would say, you, the United States, even though you're having problems, stay with us, stay engaged in this. And without U.S. leadership, nobody is going to be doing this. So, you know, Madeleine Albright, again, who my wife Leslie is here, and we used to call her Aunt Maddie at home. She's a very good friend. she used to talk about the United States being the indispensable nation. And as a refugee, which she was, she escaped both Nazism and communism as a child, her family. And she saw this country as something great, which I think it is. And I just think we have to begin getting our own house in order. And I have great faith. As I said before, we're all optimists who worry a lot. But I think everyone has to play a role if we're going to begin overcoming the political polarization that exists here.
Ken, thank you very much. And hopefully you can stay around, and I'm sure people would love to greet you, and thank you for being with us tonight. Thanks so much.